Mr. Deputy Prime Minister, I'm sorry to... can you just wrap up? Because you have spoken only 20 minutes, longer than 20 minutes.
Mr. Secretary, you spoke 25 minutes. I came here after 12 hours in the aeroplane.
Yeah, I know you have a lot to speak.
Few minutes to end my speech. Yeah. This is Syria.
How much do you have left now?
I think 5-10 minutes.
Oh, no, it's not... can you just, I will give you another, opportunity.
No, I
at
can't
the end,
divide my speech. I must continue.
You have already spoken.
I'll do my best to be...
Can you just wrap up in just 1 or 2 minutes?
No, I can't promise you. I must finish my speech.
Well, joining me now is the former Foreign Office Minister with responsibility for the Middle East, Alistair Burt MP. First, though, joining us on the line from Damascus is a Syrian activist, Susan Ahmad. And from your perspective, from the perspective of people enduring day-to-day life in Syria, what are your hopes from these peace talks?
Thank you for having me for today. For Geneva talks and these peace talks, we Syrians are looking actually up to these talks and hope that after Geneva conference, things get better in Syria. At least we might have ceasefire, we might lift siege and open humanitarian corridors to besieged areas. At least we can get our detainees out of jails. We hope that Assad's forces want to break into houses out of Sudan and arrest whoever they want for no reason, under the pretext of that they might be against the regime.
Do you think it's realistic for the world to talk about a transition regime without Assad in it?
Of course it makes sense. The thing that doesn't make sense is talking about a transitional regime with Assad, because how come then people can accept a person who spent 3 years killing them, shelling their cities, destroying their houses, and just displacing them? So it doesn't make sense actually to accept that person in the coming days, let's say. So it doesn't make any sense to have Assad anymore in Syria.
How much longer do you think that people of Syria can simply go on in the awful circumstances in which everyone's having to live their lives? It seems almost that this conflict has become indefinite.
Actually, the situation here is very hard. Things are getting worse and worse, especially for people, for civilians. We don't know how far we can still handle this, how long we can still endure that hard situation. Because, we are talking about millions of people who are suffering from shelling, suffering from arresting people out of Sudan, from displacement. And after that, now they are suffering from imposing siege and preventing people from having the basic supplies. So Syrians are handling all kinds of war weapons. The last one is the starvation, because people are dying out of hunger now due to the siege imposed on certain areas by Assad's forces. We don't know how far we can handle this, but we know that we want to live in peace, and we are doing our best actually to achieve that aim and to have peaceful life again in Syria.
Susan Ahmad, thank you very much indeed for joining us, and apologies for the quality of the line. Alistair Burt clearly hopes that there can be a transition government, yet we saw the very defiant tone being taken by the Syrian government foreign minister there at the talks. Is there any reason, really, why the regime should give ground?
The worry at the moment is the regime is talking from a very strong position. The foreign minister made clear in, as you say, defiant, very uncompromising speech, which bore no reality to the events that had taken place over the last 3 years in terms of the responsibility of the regime and what has happened since. it is essential to have this process, but unless there is some sort of pressure on the regime, you wonder why, with the Russians behind them and the Iranians behind them, why they should concede. But if they don't, as your correspondent made clear, the people of Syria cannot see a future with Assad. So something has got to give.
Where would that pressure come from? Or have to come from?
Well, I think in the current circumstances, it will come most likely from Russia, realising there is a wider interest that they have in settling the conflict.
Of course, Russia has the world's focus on it, coincidentally, because of the Sochi Winter Games.
It does. They've been an ally of the regime. They have their own interests to protect, but they must know how much damage this is doing them throughout the Arab world with their support of the regime. So the political pressure can come from then. If, however, the opposition had the chance to defend themselves and had access to the sort of weapons which would prevent, as John Kerry indicated this morning, the bombing they're suffering from, the heavy weaponry they're suffering from, that might also help to move the situation on the ground. But I doubt that Geneva will get into that.
Well, let's bring in Dr. Yazam Abdullah, who's an academic who was on the plane with the official Syrian delegation on the way over here. What are the expectations of the Syrian government delegation? What are they hoping or think they can achieve at these talks in Montreux?
Hi, good afternoon to you. I think the hope is really to reach a political settlement, and that's the hope for all Syrians. It is now 3 years down a crisis that has resulted in the suffering of over 8 million people now. We have millions of people who have fled the country, and a lot of people who are internally displaced, a lot of casualties, and the economy is suffering. So the hope is that a political settlement will come into reality, and that will be supported by the international community. It's very, very important now. It's only logical to understand that there's no political solution that can be reached that addresses the aspirations of the Syrian people and puts an end to the violence unless it is supported by the international community and the regional powers. So the hope is that such
what about the position
today
of President Assad? You know, clear statements from the Americans, the British and others that a transition government must not include the Assad family. Is there any preparedness on behalf of the official delegation even to contemplate that?
I really can't answer that question because from what I'm observing, I can only speculate that a political solution will come into reality if the talks manage to engage the two sides on the negotiating table. There's no room for preconditions, and the aim of today, or the aim of this week, is really to implement the Geneva I communique, and one of the most important terms in the communique is to put an end to violence. Now, putting an end to violence today is slightly different to putting an end to violence at the start of the crisis, because now you have a country that is war-torn and infested by terrorism from all around the world. Of course, a political settlement that addresses the aspirations of all Syrians should also be put in place. So they have two sides to really reach an agreement. One, international support to fighting terrorism, and also addressing all political parties and all Syrian people in a perspective that can be shared by all Syrians. This is challenging. This is not very, very easy to do, especially.
I just want to ask Mr. Al-Sabat, do you think there's any room on the side of the Americans and the international community which could save Assad's skin to a certain extent and still bring about an agreement and solution?
Geneva I also included a political transition that was as important as stopping the fighting. At the moment, nothing is more important than having a ceasefire and stopping the fighting, but the political transition is a clear part of Geneva I. Whether or not there is any escape route for Assad physically...
And that the end of Assad?
Yes, yeah. As Susan Ahmed says, you cannot see a way in which that would... you could have a Syria continue in the future after the loss of legitimacy of Assad. But I think it's also important, there is a narrative here which your correspondent just now has tended to repeat, which is Assad against terrorism. It is not Assad against terrorism. It is Assad against his own people, represented by the opposition coalition, who are not terrorists. There are extremists there. They have come into the equation because it wasn't settled early and because it suited the regime to have this narrative going on. The opposition coalition represent the people of Syria, and they deserve the opportunity for a transition process which will eventually have the Syrian people deciding on their own future.
I do want to ask you about what came up at question time today, the implication coming from the opposition that in the case of giving accommodation to some of the refugees in this country, Britain may be doing its bit in terms of giving aid to the refugee camps and doing its bit in terms of taking asylum seekers, but ordinary refugees, we're not doing our bit in taking refugees. What would you say to that?
My view on this is I think the government's extraordinary position on supporting refugees in Lebanon and Jordan, the amount of money we put in more than the EU put together, is at risk by not taking refugees as part of the UN programme, and that would be a shame. We have done an extraordinary job. The Prime Minister is right. It isn't an answer to have a small number of refugees placed elsewhere. The answer is to return people to Syria. But I would be very disappointed if all the great work we'd done was undone by people feeling we weren't working with the UN. I got a sense by the end of the exchange that perhaps the Prime Minister might be looking at who we could take in. But the answer should be stopping the fighting, finding a way for refugees to return. But the part the United Kingdom, this government, has played in supporting people, and those countries themselves in hosting people, has been extraordinary. But the violence has got to end.
Thank you both very much indeed for joining me. Thank you.
Prominent